Okay, Seth, I think we're all set. If you want to go ahead and start it off.
Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here today. My name is Seth Winger. I'm the Director of Science at the University of Georgia River Basin Center. And I was invited to organize this Cyberseminar series by Todd Rasmussen. So for the next 5 weeks, we're going to be hearing talks under the overall title of Sustainable Urban Streams, Science to Support Evolving Management Objectives. And our first talk today is from Larry Band. And I'll give Larry his formal introduction in a moment. But first I want to make a quick plug for the other 4 talks in our series, which I hope you will also attend. Next week we've got Derek Booth, who's going to be talking about watershed context and the evolution of urban streams. He's going to be exploring the management implications of different regional and watershed settings on development and restoration of urban channels. The week after that, November 14th, we'll have Tim Fletcher, University of Melbourne, who'll be talking about the Little Stringybark Creek project, which was the world's first full catchment retrofit of stormwater infiltration and management practices, which he and Professor Chris Walsh have been studying since 2008. The 4th talk will be by Emma Rosie Marshall, an ecologist, and she'll be discussing contaminants of emerging concern as agents of ecological change in urban streams. And finally, we'll take a break then for Thanksgiving holiday, and then on December 5th, Ann Jefferson will present Stormwater Stream Connectivity, Process, Context, and Trade-offs, looking at new insights in the downstream effects of conventional stormwater management and green infrastructure practices. But for today, it is my pleasure to introduce Larry Band. Dr. Band is the Voight Gilmore Distinguished Professor of Geography and the Director of the Institute for the Environment at the University of North Carolina. And he's also a visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Science. His work focuses on watershed ecohydrology, particularly the coevolution of ecological and hydrological systems. These days he's working primarily at 2 long-term ecological research sites, the Coweta LTER in North Carolina and the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, one of our 2 urban LTERs in the U.S. Dr. Band is also the 2014 Birdsall-Dreiss lecturer, and he's taking a quick break from his lecture tour to give us a special version of one of his talks titled Green Infrastructure, Groundwater, and the Sustainable City. So I will turn it over right now to Dr. Band.
Great, thanks very much for that nice introduction, Seth. And welcome to a special Halloween edition of the Quasi Cyberseminar. I'm hoping this won't actually be a horror show, but since you're all muted, I won't hear you screaming anyway. To give you context for this seminar series, we're going to start today really right at the source, at the runoff production, stormwater production site, to look to see how we could make use of, or what the function of green infrastructure is, in terms of mediating both surface and groundwater flows as part of efforts to reduce both stormwater and nutrients going into receiving water bodies. You see the city and county of Baltimore on the screen here. Both city and county are subject to $1 billion, approximately $1 billion consent decrees with the EPA to reduce nitrogen emissions into the Baltimore Harbor that you can see here in the Chesapeake Bay. And they are working to redesign the drainage infrastructure, including the restoration of green infrastructure, to try to ameliorate that stormwater problem. So first, any talk like this that's integrative is going to be drawing from the work of a large number of colleagues. These are a series of graduate students, postdocs, colleagues at different institutions that I've been working with for some time. The first name that you see here, Brian Miles, has figured very prominently. A good deal of the latter part of the talk is actually drawn from his dissertation, which he's just completed. A little bit about the Birdsall-Dreiss lecture, and this is actually Birdsall-Dreiss number 31 for the year. I've given the urban green infrastructure talk about 8 times so far, so about a third green infrastructure, a third critical zone subsurface flow and forest ecosystem development. John Birdsall was a longtime USGS employee. He was a groundwater hydrologist who set up a series of observation wells up and down the East Coast. When he died in 1975, there was a bequest made for the Birdsall Distinguished Lecture Series. The first lecture was given by Jacob Baer at the University of Wisconsin in 1978. Shirley-Dreiss was one of the Birdsall Distinguished Lecturers. She gave a great series in 1992 and was tragically killed in an automobile accident right after she completed her stint. There was additional fundraising, and since that time it's been the Birdsall-Dreiss Distinguished Lecture, and there's been a series of very distinguished hydrologists giving this lecture over the years. It's expanded from the single talk that Jacob Baer gave up to the 40s, 50s, and up to 70 talks during the year. So this is an active travel activity. First, the guiding questions for my talk. How does green infrastructure, which we'll define in a moment, function within eco-hydrologic flow networks in urban watersheds? What is its hydrologic and ecosystem and biogeochemical functions? Secondly, how can we design GI elements and networks to recover ecosystem services within urban watersheds? And because we are building these elements in people's communities and front yards and backyards, also provide attractive landscapes for residents. This is a critical point, and it's a crossover into essentially community sociology, so this talk can be seen as part of the emerging socio-hydrology area as well. Finally, because we've derived a lot of our eco-hydrological knowledge and principles from studying unmanaged ecosystems, how can we translate those principles and knowledge from unmanaged ecosystems and apply them to urban watersheds? First, a definition of green infrastructure. There will be many. The one I'm going to work with is that green infrastructure is a network of vegetative features, not a single element. And it's important that we see this as a network of elements, of vegetative features, along hydrologic flow paths designed to restore ecosystem services by promoting infiltration and evapotranspiration, reduce the amount of, shift the water balance more towards green water, in other words, evapotranspiration, as opposed to blue water, or perhaps in the case of urban areas, gray or brown water. But besides this, it should also function as part of sustainability initiatives in a number of these cities, both for stormwater mitigation, nutrient retention. In Baltimore, nitrogen into the bay is the main point that's involved, but also improvement of carbon sequestration, microclimate modification, habitat and biodiversity, and I'll just add there's a series of other potential benefits for this. This can include green roofs, rain gardens, swale drains, constructed wetlands, expanded or retained forest canopy, tree canopy, downspout disconnections, a whole range of different types of features that increases the amount of green canopy and can also reroute the flow network itself. And we should see this as an alternative or complement to traditional gray infrastructure, because really this green infrastructure is being redesigned on top of hundreds of years of drainage paradigms that have been designed very often for very different goals. We'll go into that in a second. So the question is really, what GI elements, what types of green infrastructure and network designs can most closely enable eco-hydrological processes that can mitigate urban stormwater while providing community benefits and returning these types of ecosystem services? So I'm going to contrast. I'll start off talking about some of these unmanaged systems, so we could start looking at some of these eco-hydrological principles and see how these principles can be translated into these urban ecosystems. As Seth mentioned, most of my work recently has been in a set of LTERs, long-term ecological research sites. I work in a series of other sites as well, especially more recently in China. The Coweta Hydrological Lab is one of the oldest Forest Service experimental watersheds, dating back to 1935. It's been an LTER since the beginning in 1980. And in this region, the interplay between rainfall, microclimate, surface and subsurface flow, and the types of ecosystems that result has been an area of investigation for the last 80 years, and there are detailed data sets for that. So within this region, just about all rainfall will enter these coarse colluvial soils, unless it's saturated, and move down slope at different rates bringing with it nutrients, organic matter, and so forth. Forest ecosystem then grows to the limiting resources, to the amount of water or nitrogen within those, or temperature limitations within those areas. And in turn, the different forms of the forest ecosystem regulate the water and nutrient cycling in this area. So you get a very nice catenary effect of an increase in leaf area. That's the subject of my other Birdsall-Dreiss talk, as the system is responding to additional resources, as long as those are limiting resources. Now, as we move into the urban ecosystem, the Baltimore ecosystem study, what you're seeing here is a 1 meter LiDAR data set with high resolution multispectral data and then simulated flow paths, just taking D infinity, just routing water down the DEM, the terrain model itself. And what you could see is the flow is based on topography, but also to a great extent on the built environment. We have gauges. Seth and Emily, I'm not sure if people can see actually my mouse on here. Is that correct?
They wouldn't see your mouse, no.
They don't see my mouse. Okay, so I don't really have a way of pointing in that case. We do have a gauge on this watershed. It's a USGS gauge that's been in place for several years at this point. High resolution rainfall and a good deal of detailed information on the soils and built environment in this area. So we want to see, as we move water around this area, unlike Coweta where the ecosystem develops spontaneously, this is a heavily managed ecosystem. Can we rearrange and plant and put different types of vegetation and vegetation densities at different flow path positions along this network so that we could optimize or maximize stormwater and nutrient retention? So in unmanaged landscapes, we've worked on this extensively. A number of us have been developing and applying this model that we call RHESSys, Regional Hydro-Ecological Simulation System. It is a simplified process dynamic, but comprehensive in terms of integrating distributed hydrology with carbon canopy and subsurface carbon exchange and cycling and nitrogen exchange. So if you look at the upper right, there is an ecosystem model that does the basic photosynthesis, has a stomatal physiology, will produce photosynthate allocated around to the plant's surface and subsurface. And if you go to the lower left, and grow essentially an ecosystem in different parts of the landscapes. It's based on a hill slope hydrology paradigm, and excess moisture and soluble nutrients from upslope will propagate downslope by different flow processes and provide that essentially downslope subsidy of water and nitrogen. So you will evolve essentially the ecosystem according to topographic, microclimate, and other controls. That ecosystem that's developed then regulates water and nitrogen flux. So you should see it as a co-evolving system rather than a single driving entity. We want to bring this into urban areas and apply the principles developed through this type of paradigm, not just the actual numerical simulation, but through the paradigm into these urban systems. So in Coweta, what you could see, Coweta is 20 square kilometers, southern Appalachian, steep mountainous area. And I can't show the animations here, but this would have been 1 year worth of simulations. But what you could see is the classic variable source area concept for these mountainous regions. The light blue is cut at 60% root zone saturation. The dark blue is getting towards saturation. And as rainfall progresses, you see these saturation areas expanding and contracting up and down these hollows. That affects the ecosystem processes directly, both by providing more water and potentially nutrients as limiting resources, or providing essentially saturation and low oxygen concentrations that can limit nutrient cycling and actually inhibit higher plant growth. So you could actually derive wetlands in some area and promote nitrogen cycling towards denitrification. So the ability to simulate coupled watershed hydrology in a distributed mode, carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling is what we want to be able to implement in this urban area. So we could describe and derive how constructed wetlands or rain gardens or other types of green infrastructure will control water and nitrogen movement downslope and towards the bay. Okay, once again, this is getting somewhat long in the tooth in terms of basic hydrology concepts, but it's still a very powerful concept for distributed hydrology, this variable source area concept. It is sometimes referred to as the Dunn diagram. It was first published in the mid-1970s. And under this conceptualization, we could see on the left-hand side, that would be our urban environments where Hortonian overland flow is dominant. And as we move towards less developed landscapes, left-hand side is also perhaps agricultural sites. But let's treat that as the urban end of the spectrum. The right-hand side would be the Coweta or the forested area. And depending on the topography and on the soil conductivities and subsurface conductivities, this variable source concept can develop by expanding saturation flow as the system wets up, as I showed you with Coweta, or contracting it as it dries down through the summer or through dry periods, or promoting rapid subsurface storm flow. So these are seen as two different types of watersheds. What we'll see is, of course, in our urbanizing systems, we're actually mixing these intricately together because what's coming from that left-hand side is going to enter the right-hand side as run-on infiltration. That's the low-impact development design and what we're designing green infrastructure for. So as I mentioned, we are, if you look towards the bottom, and at least on my screen, there we go, that retention period which is present, which is the design of green infrastructure, is superimposed on a century or more of other paradigms in terms of stormwater management. The upper one, rapid development and expansion, can be seen or termed as the industrial city. And in the 19th century in American and Western European countries, and in fact today in a good deal of the developing world, there was rapid development and expansion but no drainage infrastructure. Drinking water and drainage were cycled closely in close contact. Therefore, there was massive inundation, flooding, epidemics, thousands of deaths due to cholera and other diarrheal diseases were common during that time. Infant mortality was high. So the idea was, gee, we have to separate these and we have to get rid of the tainted water, the polluted water as fast as possible, get it out of the areas, and that was then the transformation to what's called the sanitary cities, building sewer systems, stormwater systems, sanitary systems, in many cases combined systems, lining streams. The Los Angeles River is probably the penultimate example of that, where we're simply building hydraulically efficient networks to get rid of water and waste as quickly as possible. This actually was a terrific victory in public health because infant mortality dropped dramatically, diarrheal diseases by putting in both treated water supplies and this efficient drainage of effluent caused a massive improvement in public health. However, the unintended environmental and human health impacts is that you're simply exporting waste and flooding downstream. So after the Clean Water Act, the idea of, gee, instead of getting rid of the water as fast as possible, let's try to hold it back in detention basins and by promoting infiltration. This worked to an extent in terms of shaving peaks of urban hydrographs, but it does not. It only deals with a reduction of surface flow peaks. It doesn't really reduce volumes, and it really only considers surface flow. Overall, it may not be shifting because of this massive decrease in the vegetation. It may not be shifting the water balance towards greater green water or evapotranspiration. So more recently, in concert with detention and infiltration, is let's revegetate the city. Let's do it strategically by designing different types of ecosystem patches, ecosystem installations in different locations along the flow networks. And we'll go further downstream. Derek will talk more about urban streams next week. And then we'll hear a little bit more about what happens over the entire watershed. Once again, we'll look at the source here. So this is just other evidence as to the very close interplay between what I'll call, and you'll see I put it in quotation marks, natural drainage systems or spontaneous drainage systems and the engineered drainage system. This is a sanitary sewer overflow in Baltimore. Baltimore was one of the first cities to separate its sewers so that you're trying to just move waste alone out of the watershed. But you have an intricate network of small to much larger pipes, generally gravity fed, so running down the lower parts of the landscape, particularly in contact with the groundwater. And with the reduction of vegetation and the massive reduction in evapotranspiration, groundwater tables may have risen significantly in certain parts of the landscape. And of course, there's quite a bit of debate as to what types of urbanization could drop groundwater tables because of impervious cover. But if we're trying and promoting to infiltrate water, we should be expecting groundwater tables may come up. The pipes are old, they're leaky. Even when they're new, the joints leak. And when groundwater tables are high, you get infiltration into them. And during storms, when you could also get inflow through the manholes, you pressurize these pipes, which were never designed to conduct a good deal of water. This is about a 40-kilogram manhole that's being lifted up by the force of this flow, and of course you're seeing a good deal of gray water coming directly out. So you could think of it as simply another form of preferential flow paths. You could think of it as the urban analogy to macroporosity or natural piping in these systems. And once again, when the pressure gradient is such that you'll force water in, you get these very rapid responses. There's different types of pipes, of course, and if you look at the upper diagram, potable water supply is piped in, so we're adding to the rainfall in this area. That should be highest in the soil column, so it's not being bathed by leaking effluent. A little bit lower down should be the storm drains, which should just be conducting storm flow, but we know that there's all sorts of series of shunts and cross connections in these systems over time. And finally, on the bottom are these sanitary sewers, which can act as sinks for groundwater under high groundwater tables or sources for effluent into groundwater under lower groundwater tables. So management of the groundwater is quite critical. Just to give more evidence of the intricate interplay between the engineered and the natural flow paths, the lower diagram is fluoride concentration sampled over a 40-kilometer length of the Gwynns Falls watershed in Baltimore. And you can see the fluoride concentration approximately tripling over that length. And of course, that's coming from the treated water supply, so these are by no means kept separately. The billion-dollar consent decree Baltimore and Baltimore County are both subject to is being spent to a great extent on trying to improve these systems, but also on green infrastructure, stream restoration, and educational programs. So over time, we've buried a good deal of streams. The low order streams are in pipes. In fact, some of the high order streams are actually in pipes in places like Baltimore as well. But the overall drainage density has drastically increased. This is a paper put out by Ken Belt and Sujay Kaushal a couple of years ago, so that even if we can achieve run-on infiltration and infiltrate water, besides the large increase in the amount of leaking pipes that can act as tile drains, of course they're very often surrounded by gravel in these trenches, so there's higher conductivity regions. The flow path length to the nearest efficient drainage line has drastically reduced. So the residence time has reduced. We get much more rapid flow out and interconnection of effluent with the natural system. This is some work that Claire Welty and her student Aditi Bhaskar published out of Aditi's dissertation a couple of years ago. And it's done for the city of Baltimore to try to quantify how much water is actually going out by inflow and infiltration into sanitary sewers. So what they did is they drew data from available information for the urban sites. There's two sites, Gwynns Runs and Moores Runs, so a small sample. A good deal of the information on I&I and inflow and infiltration was collected by consultants. And so you have to view this information as being approximate, but giving at least order of magnitude estimates of the shift in water balance. The upper mean rural watershed, so areas with greater amounts of vegetation beyond the urban service boundary, so it does not have extensive storm and sanitary sewers, about 1,100 millimeters precipitation, and then an estimated ET somewhere about 800 millimeters. This may be a little bit of an overestimate. It's actually modeled. It's not measured, and nor is it done by mass balance from the watersheds. In fact, if you've done the math, the inflows and outflows are not balancing here because each one is estimated separately. Stream flow somewhere about 400 millimeters, so most of the water is going up into green water as evapotranspiration. Move into the city, the precipitation is a little bit higher because it's closer to the coast, but because of this massive decrease in vegetation, the evapotranspiration is estimated as having dropped substantially, 450 millimeters. Leakage from the shipped water from the water supply, averaging about 159 millimeters additional water coming in. I on the left-hand side is irrigation, based on the amount of lawn area and the lawn watering season, maybe another 25 millimeters. Of course, locally this can be much higher. Stream discharge, though, has risen, but only to about 460 millimeters. And these I&I studies, actually studying flow within these sanitary sewers, upwards of 500 millimeters. Once again, as a representative value, this could be high. Of course, these two watersheds were studied because they were considered to be problems. The important thing is the loss of vegetation has resulted in this massive decrease in ET. Where does the water go? Well, partially to stream flow, but it's rising, it's resulting in a greater storage, in other words, higher groundwater tables. In this case, it's estimating more water is leaving by sanitary sewers, which is routed all the way out to the treatment plants on the Chesapeake Bay, or comes out as surcharges that I showed you before. So if you can recreate and recover some of the lost evapotranspiration capacity in this area by strategically increasing canopy or putting in other types of green infrastructure, can you bring up the ET, drop the groundwater tables, and drop the amount of inflow and infiltration? And besides Baltimore, a set of cities are actually looking at fairly aggressive green infrastructure campaigns to figure out how much can we drop, how much will the green infrastructure cost, what sort of drop of the groundwater table can we get, how much will that reduce I&I, how much will that reduce surcharges, and are looking to try to monetize that to see what's the replacement cost for the amount of treatment that we would otherwise have to put in. So if we think about green infrastructure installation, we have to think of the city as not a monolithic area, but a gradient of regions. And in Baltimore, you see the upper area for the Baltimore ecosystem study is Baseman Run beyond the urban services boundary. The water balance is simply precipitation is equal to stream flow plus evapotranspiration plus storage change. On groundwater wells, 2-acre zoning, so on septic systems as well. Everything is internally cycled. There is concern among the residents about the amount of nitrogen in their wells, and a number of residents have told us that when they moved in, the first thing their neighbors said is, check your nitrate levels in your sewers. And people are aware of this recycling that takes place. Dead Run, the lower portion in red, is an inner suburb that's I-695 cutting across, curving up towards the northwest there. And it's where the Social Security Administration, so there's a lot of big box stores, a lot of impervious area, about 40% impervious, and then medium density housing, well within the urban services boundary, sanitary sewers, storm sewers, piped water. Watershed 263, Baseman Run and Dead Run are named for streams that have people's or place names. In Baltimore, all these streams are buried. Nobody has their name attached to a buried stream. So it's simply sewer or buried stream number 263 and watershed 263. If you watch The Wire on HBO, this is the west side. So that gives you an idea of the type of landscape. Lots of abandoned housing. Actually, that provides for potential to retrofit with green infrastructure because the city has been pulling down a lot of crumbling row houses. But the question we get is, how do we design the green infrastructure in these areas so it will improve quality of life for the residents? Asking the residents will be much more resonant than asking a bunch of hydrologists and ecologists that. But if you can see it, and it's a little bit cut off on my screen, you add the water supply and the sewer export as part of the water balance. Okay, this is a simplified view of the urban development on hydrologic partitioning. This comes from an NRC, a National Research Council committee that both Derek and I and others were on a few years ago, several years ago. And once again, just reiterating, going from before to after development, reduction in green infrastructure and canopy, increase in impervious areas, vastly increases surface runoff, reduces shallow subsurface flow, what's called interflow, and reduces base flow. This is simplified because we're not looking into the subsurface that much. A lot of stormwater is only concerned with surface water. And the paradigm has been, if you could infiltrate it, you could throw up your hands and declare victory. And what we want to see, looking back at those done diagrams, is what happens to the water after it infiltrates. This is essentially the subject of Jeff McDonald's, one of Jeff McDonald's Birdsall-Dreiss lectures from a few years ago. Where does water go when it rains? Largely in unmanaged catchments, but we're also asking those questions in these urbanized catchments. So if we take a critical zone view of this, the left-hand side is a convexo-concave hill slope, soil, saprolite, fractured bedrock, a variety of different hill slope flow processes that could be shallow to deep, that can either provide flow in the shallow subsurface that can subsidize downslope ecosystems, or bypass them if it's going into deeper fractured bedrock and just coming up in the riparian zone. If we move into the neighborhood, we put in all these mid-slope drains that are called streets with gutters on them to concentrate flow, distributed impervious areas in terms of rooftops, run-on infiltration to the nearby lawns or pervious areas, and of course this dense network of pipes of different forms. Some stormwater that's shown here that goes immediately into the close stream, or if it's a combined sewer, can overflow into that stream under high flows, otherwise is piped out towards the treatment plants. So we need to pay attention and put together our distributed models with this much more integrated, much shorter length scale set of flow paths with much higher conductivities in the near surface. So we rewrite our done diagram to be this, or our variable source area runoff concept, to have these extra components. First of all, Hortonian overland flow, in other words, the left-hand side is not independent of the right-hand side. In fact, the whole concept of low-impact development or water-sensitive urban design is to route overland flow from impervious or compacted areas into nearby pervious areas as run-on infiltration. This could route out right as Hortonian overland flow if there's not the infiltration capacity, in other words, if it's fairly compacted. Or it could saturate those areas because you could be doubling the amount of water entering over and above the precipitation by routing roof or street or other impervious zone runoff onto those areas. So you could be saturating those and simply short-circuiting that expected infiltration loss, so it's coming out of saturation overland flow. And because we have very short effective subsurface flow lengths with potentially very high conductivities because of all the piping, gravel trenches, and so forth in these areas, we could be getting more rapid subsurface storm flow. In addition, we could simply be forming pressure waves that we found in natural landscapes, and of course these types of preferential flow paths through sewer I&I that you see on the lower left. So if we were able to achieve largely evapotranspiration or largely recharge into deeper groundwater with longer residence time, we would say these catchments have higher capacitance. They can absorb an input and dissipate it slowly. If we get a short circuit by just routing it out as saturation overland flow, subsurface storm flow, or a sewer I&I, then this is a low capacitance watershed. You're simply dissipating that extra recharge rapidly. And so we want to look to see under what conditions can you put green infrastructure, in what types of hydrogeologies, in what types of landscapes to achieve more high capacitance systems. So once again, this area of dead run, this is actually what we'll call dead run 5. There are 5 gauged catchments within the larger dead run watershed. And a hill slope that we could see within this area that includes rooftop, driveways, streets, streams, and so forth, that you'll see from the left-hand side represented on the upper right-hand side. We want to be able to simulate all the hydrologic and biogeochemical and carbon flux processes we do in forested regions in these areas now dominated by lawns and interacting with impervious zones. So if you look at the lower right, a typical street view, and this is from Google Street Views, is a downspout that's spilling onto lawn. The 2 houses nearby are built up a little bit. That's purposeful, so of course the foundations don't flood. They should shed water away. That little swale in between is subject to run-on infiltration. That's the idea of the disconnected downspouts. That area, the question is, can you put green infrastructure there to reduce the amount of saturation excess overland flow? If you're here in the spring or after rainy events, this area is pretty darn muddy and wet. Can you put certain types of green infrastructure that will actively transpire and reduce the amount of soil moisture that's retained there? And also be able to increase the amount of carbon content and advance the nitrogen cycle. So the rain garden basics, most of you have seen this. This is a very simple cartoon. The downspout disconnection, which otherwise might have spilled onto a driveway, out into the street, down a storm sewer, and right out to the streams, is now routed to a planted rain garden or even into an area with greater tree canopy. The downspout disconnections could be to the lawn. If you're going to put in a rain garden, it has to have a certain minimum height just to overcome aerodynamic resistance and have enough leaf area to be an effective transpiring system. And of course, the design of the types of species, their resilience to different types of hydroclimate, and their growing season length is an important choice. In this case, in this cartoon, you see all the infiltration moving downward. And so this is envisioned that you're getting infiltration deeper into the groundwater. Our question is, if this fills up with water and recharges, what type of infiltration you'll get? Will you get it entirely downward? Will it saturate and just short circuit? And how much is actually going laterally into the nearby pervious areas? By the way green infrastructure is typically designed and managed within these cities is not by arranging them along hydrologic flow paths, and not by calculating how much evapotranspiration or nitrogen retention or carbon sequestration takes place in different positions, but simply by stating this is a green roof, assigning a runoff reduction, a total phosphorus production, and so forth, and simply putting it into a spreadsheet, hitting summation along the columns and then across the rows, and that's your answer. So these are actually designed and implemented as independent elements. We want to run this within a distributed eco-hydrologic model so you could have the interaction and the importance of location for each one of these elements. So the example here of a low-impact development hill slope is you have run-on infiltration into a rain garden. The question is this producing this type of deep infiltration shown in that rain garden cartoon? Or is it actually just shedding water in the shallow subsurface, which we've seen in a large number of unmanaged watersheds? So shallow through flow could become more dominant. And you might just be increasing the soil moisture of the surrounding soils. How much is actually maintained? What's the effect of putting greater canopy upslope versus downslope? And how can you promote these systems so that you may get areas that will enhance carbon uptake and denitrification in the proper areas, in the areas where it will receive the proper amount of drainage? Okay, so just a little bit of visualization. This is Baseman Run. And once again, this is the example of the enhanced increase of water, fairly well irrigated lawns. This is Mr. Lawn King. You can see that truck on the lower right-hand side, so increasing the nutrient, the fertilizer use. And then this mid-slope drain that's called a gutter. In the foreground, you could see that dark spot is a storm sewer, even though this is well beyond the urban services boundary, that simply routes the water from this area right out to the stream. What's the appropriate type of green infrastructure here? Where should it be put? We've experimented with putting increased forest canopy in the upslope and in the downslope. I won't go through that today, but would the residents accept greater shrub density or other types of green infrastructure right in what I'll call this riparian zone, this toe slope right before the curb itself? And can we simply put that in, derive and build up the over time by the simulate joint carbon, water, biogeochemical simulation, build up the soil characteristics and maintain this as a sink, so we can look at the effectiveness as a sink for both water and nutrients in this area. Very different type of landscape in Watershed 263, where this is once again the west side in the HBO series. Not much open space in the past when this was a densely populated area. Population densities are down 50% at this point, but there are no surface streams. So we have our instrumentation down manhole covers, and the question is, how do you then design green infrastructure here? There's much more limited places where you can put it, and the residents that will approve of this or should be helping to maintain this may not actually own the land that it's built on. So in one cases, the area is dominated by private property. In the other cases, it's probably dominated by city-owned rights-of-ways. But residents live in that area. They have to be involved in designing and maintaining this because it has to be an urban amenity. Detention and infiltration paradigms. When we started working in Baltimore County, there was already 1,200 detention ponds that had been built. This was in 1998. These areas are now being retrofitted as bioretention ponds. And once again, we have a large impervious area that's now spilling into an enclosed depression. So we have to develop a better hydrologic theorem. We have to look around to see where are the paradigms for having essentially what's a depression-focused recharge in this area. So in this case, this is a rain garden. This is actually a retrofitted bioretention site in Chapel Hill. And you can see besides the detention store, you can see the riser on the right-hand side, the berm, so there's a detention store. Trees are being planted in the middle to evapotranspire deeply. But you also may be able to see in the foreground a large number of shrubs have been planted right around the berms in anticipation of lateral infiltration that they can contribute to uptake to an evapotranspiration sink. So in the past, where we've seen this and where we could draw theory from is prairie potholes. So this is a depression-focused recharge. This is a picture 50 kilometers west of Saskatoon. And in spring, when people are praying for snowmelt, depending on the temperatures at the time of the first snowfall, we could be looking at frozen ground, so snowmelt simply runs off an impervious surface, accumulates in all these dark spots that ranges from puddles to Lake Winnipeg, and then raise the water levels in both the ponds and the groundwater levels. And then because of the nature of the hydrogeology, highly conductive soils at the surface, it's semi-arid, it's fractured due to shrinkage cracks, low high-density tills below, a lot of the infiltration is actually laterally, and you develop spontaneously these willow rings. This is the classic Mayboom description of the prairie pothole that have enough evapotranspiration to then return the groundwater table back to its former pre-snowmelt conditions. This is what we'd like to achieve in the detention-focused recharge for the green infrastructure. So it's not just the vegetation you put in within the depression, within the rain garden, it's actually what's surrounding it as well. So these are high-resolution simulations for dead run. We're using a 3-meter, this is either a 3 or a 5-meter grid for this, and then we're putting a series of ordinances. Can't put a rain garden within 10 feet of a house, 3 meters. Has to be downslope, can't be upslope of a house because you'll flood the basements. We're putting in a certain type of vegetation. We're putting in the type of soils in those areas, and the lower right shows you the blues are areas that satisfy those constraints. We're rerouting the rooftop drainage in pink to go to these rain gardens, and then we run a series of simulations, or Brian Miles, whose dissertation this one, runs a series of simulations with all the rooftops connected directly to impervious area and connected to the impervious areas, in other words, into these rain gardens, or under mapped connectivity. This area, Dead Run 5, it's about 42% impervious. The residential rooftop is only about 6 to 7%, maybe a little bit higher at this point. Non-residential rooftop is high as well, so there's limited impervious area as a total cover. So even if you had 100% compliance, everybody disconnects their rooftop. We're looking for the marginal gain, not the absolute reduction in stormwater. So this would be one of a series of treatments. I can't run an animation over the web. I could run it, it'll look fine here. Well, I can't do it because it's a PDF. But once again, like the Coweta site, distributed soil moisture and saturation levels around these areas. This happens to be just the start of the year, January 1, 2008, so everything is fairly wet right now, high groundwater tables. But we'll see the evolution of the soil moisture, root zone saturation, and groundwater table evolutions with these distributed models, and the consequent either water scarcity or inundation saturation areas that can promote denitrification. We could also add and schedule irrigation. We could schedule fertilization from social surveys we've run in this area. So this is an example of two simulations. One, the left-hand side, a small watershed in Baltimore. The other one, a small watershed in Durham. This is the right-hand one is part of an experiment called rain catchers. There's been a reverse auction in this area to ask people, how much do you want to be paid for us to install green infrastructure in your front or backyard? So there's been a series of small-scale green infrastructure put in. What we're interested in here is green shows those areas where you're getting simply increased saturation overland flow. You have a gain by routing water from the rooftop to the pervious area, but you have a deduction essentially then that rather than treating that as a loss, a certain percentage of that is simply going out as increased saturation overland flow. We're getting a good deal more of that in the Dead Run 5 site than we are in the Durham site, partially on the basis of the soils and also somewhat steeper topography and also the building density in these two areas. So they look fairly similar, both about 40% impervious, but the different landscape patterns, soils, and topography and layout and distribution of the impervious zones to pervious makes a difference in terms of how effective the stormwater retention actually is. I won't spend much time on this. These are calibrated models. We're getting good explanation of the total flow out of these areas. Once again, it's calibrated. It's so highly impervious. Don't be too impressed by the fact that you can get a good Nash subclif out of this, but we need to then also look at patterns of soil moisture as derived by the models and measured in the fields. So this is two figures that I'll show. The first is for Dead Run 5. The rain gardens just decrease stream flow just a bit, in fact to the point where it's not statistically significant. There's too much flow coming out as increased saturation overland flow. These are silty soils in this area, lower infiltration capacity, flatter topography, higher groundwater tables. A lot of the people in this area run sump pumps in their basements. So at least in the way we've put in rain gardens here, and just by treating the rooftop, remember, which is not that high in total area, not that much decrease. I should say the marginal increase in the reduction per hectare of impervious surface treated is more reasonable. Rain catchers, this Ellerby Creek site, gets a much greater. We're seeing a 10% decrease in storm flow, either disconnected just onto the lawns, that's the left-hand side, or disconnected with rain gardens. Durham already has a pretty fair amount of tree canopy. It's an older It's an older suburb that was developed in the 1910s. So because of the difference in hydrogeology, built environment, soils, in this specific case, we're getting a much greater response to this run-on infiltration and green infrastructure increase in evapotranspiration, really in terms of the infiltration and the higher capacitance of these watersheds. Let me get on towards finishing up because we're getting long in the tooth in terms of the section. How do you build this green infrastructure in these different areas? In Watershed 263, once again, it's built in rights-of-ways. There's no yards, private property to put this in. There are some being developed by the fact that a lot of buildings are coming down, but we're largely receiving road drainage, in this case on the right-hand side, designed with the vegetation along the periphery in anticipation of lateral infiltration. But the area has not been adopted or accepted by residents. You can't quite see it. This is typically filled with trash. The nature of this one is simply not working that well. This was a top-down installation without really thinking about how does this fit into the neighborhood. On the left-hand side, you put in these stub outs. You're actually building out from the sidewalk. These are expensive. They'll cost about $40,000 or so for an engineering firm to come in, design and install them. But once again, you need to have high vegetation, which is what you see in the foreground, so that you have higher aerodynamic conductances so you can have a reasonable amount of transpiration and leaf area. In the foreground. In the background, you see all of this has been weed whacked down. This is considered messy in the area, and residents worry that this is an area where you could harbor undesirable wildlife like rats. So in this case, this is absolutely not considered an amenity, or it has not been adopted, it has not been as effective as if somebody actually adopts and maintains this. Ultimately, maintenance of these sites can't just be due to the stormwater utility. The people who live in the area have to accept this and see it as an amenity. Tim Fletcher will talk to you about the Stringy Bark catchment. I had the good fortune to visit with them and get a great tour. And on the left-hand side, you could see this curb cut going into this rain garden with vertical structure that really builds in nicely with the design, the landscape design of these two neighbors. So this seems to be taken care of and seems to be effectively working. On the right-hand side, there's no house behind this. It's just in common area, so it's not being maintained. So this is the question in terms of how you actually work with local residents to build this in as part of the landscaping. Okay, we want to be able to provide an interface so a stormwater engineer can come in and state, I'm going to reroute a rooftop. So on the right-hand side, we have every patch named and the percentage of flow that goes in there, and we could add a receiving patch. In other words, we're going to rewire the drainage here. And as we rewire, we'll click and add a certain type of green infrastructure. This is a design element, a planimetric element. And this would be something that a stormwater engineer or hydrologist working in the area would be carrying out on a number of different properties. You need to show people what this would look like, so we're working with a set of computer scientists, so I have to point out what you see on the right-hand side, if you could read that says mulch bed, mulch mound, or small rock. We realize it looks like some other types of urban biogeochemistry. It's not. It's landscape designing features. And this is a Google Street View of somebody's yard. Now, if we come along and say, I want to grab, say, some bunch grasses, some trees, I want to plant them in this area and design a rain garden. You may not like the way this looks, but this gives a resident or a landscape designer with a resident or a stormwater engineer with a resident the ability to redesign a front yard and potentially a backyard as well, to the point where as you redefine the landscape and the vegetation, these green infrastructure parameters can be rapidly migrated off to the model so you can get a rapid turnaround. What was the saving in stormwater? What was the saving in nitrogen? How much extra carbon did you actually receive? Now, it may be that this is a web service, and it may be just that we record somebody is shopping online or somebody is looking at this web interface to see how they could potentially retrofit their yard. Would you pop up, would you like help with this? Would we have the Angie's list of green infrastructure contractors that have been approved by and accredited by the stormwater utility to potentially provide help with designing this? And would the stormwater utility be willing to invest in this on the basis of envisioned or simulated savings of water, nitrogen, and so forth? Okay. Next to last slide, we are changing once again this classic Dunn diagram to think about where water actually goes as you route water from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. It can go out as Hortonian overland flow, as saturation overland flow, as subsurface storm flow, as base flow from deeper groundwater or slower groundwater, or as evapotranspiration as green water. And we're just giving the rating for the two different catchments we worked with. Base flow and ET seem to be more effective from the rain catchers, this Ellerby Creek side in Durham. It's further south, it has a longer growing season, but there's also more trees there to begin with, sandier soils, greater topography to achieve drainage. So the details of the hydrogeology topography, in other words, all the distributed hydrology, can be built into this. Summary statement so we can quit. The GI system is designed for urban restoration and development. I'll say it's in a very initial phase. We're just experimenting with this, and we're experimenting with how you can interface directly with residents and stormwater utilities in terms of these designs. It requires consideration of the geohydrology, the topographic and flow path position of the green elements, and also the social context. These should be integrated green infrastructure networks, not independent elements, as is currently largely done. Besides urban stormwater, other ecosystem services, if we are building in a reasonable ecohydrology model, urban heat island by increased latent heat flux, in other words, a change in energy partition, carbon and nitrogen cycling, aesthetics, and habitat. And finally, to develop this and actually roll it out for cities to use, we have to simplify the use of the models. It requires improved geoinformatics so we can simplify the use of these advanced models, facilitate implementation, and generate a dialogue and discussion with the community. So thanks very much, everybody. I think we'll quit at this point and turn towards questions. Seth,
all right, thank you, Larry. That was excellent. Emily, how much time do we have? Do things cut off right at 4:30, or?
No, we can take a couple questions, but we'll try to wrap it up shortly after 4:30. We can go until about 4:35 or so.
Okay. I see there's some people who are. Go ahead, Emily.
Oh, so you can, as participants, go ahead and type your questions into the chat box.
Well, while people are typing, I've got a quick question. Larry, I was once part of a project where we were working with a large commercial development to do some major infiltration, rain garden type stuff, and we kind of got cold feet partway through because we realized we were putting a whole lot of water into the ground and we weren't sure where it was going to end up, especially with respect to neighboring properties.
Right.
Are there efforts, and then after seeing this, I'm even more concerned about that type of thing. So are there efforts to think bigger and broader for those higher density areas? We're putting those large amounts of water into the ground and we're creating increased subsurface lateral storm flow paths, of engineering those subsurface paths beyond across multiple properties?
Yeah, so that's the major issue is once you've infiltrated, where does the water go? Do you have enough distributed depression-focused recharge that you're simply raising the groundwater table? And depending on the groundwater flow paths, are you, even if you've designed it so it won't flood out your basement, are you going to start causing seepage into your neighbor's basement? And that's right. Where a number of lawsuits have been launched as people start suing each other over potential nuisance. So whereas stormwater models such as SWIM, once you infiltrate, it's gone. There's been some attempts to couple swim to a set of groundwater models. This is, I think, critical, especially because we're now trying to achieve large-scale adaptation of this type of depression-focused recharge in these urban areas. So that's one of the key questions we want to be able to ask. It shouldn't be done just in terms of this one parcel. It's how does infiltration and recharge in this parcel interact with the overall groundwater system and influence the entire neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got several questions here now. I'm going to just kind of pick one of them first. From Brad Marr, did your pre- and post-infiltration measure of flows in local streams compare peak flow versus base flow conditions?
Yeah, so we did some hydrograph separations for these areas, and we're breaking those up. I just showed you total flow changes, but as part of Brian's dissertation, we went through to see how much is this actually changing storm flow versus base flow. I didn't present that today. We're currently in the process of writing that up to get it out. For Dead Run 5, because we were just looking at residential landscapes, and your point, Seth, about the big box stores, because that's one of the conclusions, is big box stores are really where a good deal of the effort has to be. But the type of treatments we get here, we saw very small decreases in storm flow and small elevations of base flow. The marginal increase per hectare or per unit area treated was more substantial. You just have limited residential rooftops, but we were going for both peak flow and base flow augmentation or decreases.
All right. Here's a question. Go ahead.
I see that the question was, did we do it for specific design storms? We haven't pulled that out right now. We've run them for, say, 2 to 3 years. These are fairly consumptive models. We're in the process of parallelizing them and then need to start going through 30-year time domain so we could start deriving the quantiles of the flow systems under those conditions.
Okay. And there's another question from Craig Rethwell. Is there any place for deeper aquifer infiltration, like a reverse well?
In these models, it's done fairly simply. So there's a detailed routing of shallow groundwater, and then we have a deeper, essentially a groundwater reservoir term for the deeper water. It is calibrated. Once again, it's a calibrated model. I should mention Claire Welty and our students are running par flow in the area. That's much more consumptive, but it has the advantage, of course, of solving a full three-dimensional Richards equation throughout the unsaturated, saturated area. And I'd look more for a model like that to start talking about deeper groundwater. Right now, we're treating that with a calibrated, deeper reservoir.
Okay. All right. I see there's a bunch of other people who are currently typing.
I should point out on the Birdsall-Dreiss tour, interesting thing is to go and speak in different locations. This was very Baltimore Northeast humid centric. Of course, in a place like Colorado where there's prior allocation, building lots of infrastructure to evaporate more water is contrary to prior allocation. So you can slow down water, you can't actually abstract it. So there would need to be different methods used for stormwater in those areas.
That's a really interesting point. Here we got a question from Maggie Messerschmidt. Is groundwater contamination a concern in areas with deep infiltration through right-of-way infiltration practices, especially in areas with high hydraulic conductivity?
Yeah, so once again, the idea is you infiltrate, you'll get soil treatment, biological treatment, and a reduction in contaminants. If you're simply putting it into an area with high conductivity, short flow paths out to the macropores, to the sewers and trenches and so forth, then you could be simply routing water rapidly without much treatment itself. You could think of it in terms of that classic ratio of the advection of the velocities of the water to the reaction scales, essentially a dam color number. And in these areas, you have rapid transport and perhaps limited treatment. The idea of green infrastructure is to develop not just the evapotranspiration, but more organic, rich material that will be more bioactive. So actually laying them out in a manner that will optimize those ratios is critical. When we work in China, of course, this is a critical issue because large areas of both urban and agricultural regions are seeing what sounds to us here, makes us think that the U.S. is pristine, enormous contamination levels. So the people I'm working in the Chinese Academy of Sciences are looking at this type of retrofit and what the limits are to that to actually start restoring these areas.
Well, since you brought up China, there's some other questions here, but I want to ask one of my own. I've worked with some folks, I've been having conversations with folks in southern Mexico who are very concerned that they're in cities now where they're just beginning to they're really getting into what you call the sanitary city phase only now, and they're dealing with flooding problems and with untreated wastewater problems, trying to get that out there. And so they're starting to pave their channels and straighten. So people are wondering, is that a necessary phase to go through as part of development, or are there reasonably cost-effective ways to maybe leapfrog over that phase of development?
So I think this will certainly link to Derek's talk next week. If you do nothing in the uplands where all the runoff and waste is being produced, then if you have those loads that you need to get rid of, that's why we started to design these hydraulically efficient methods of getting rid of water to begin with. There was a reason for it. It wasn't a mistake. But if you're starting from scratch, and a lot of the developing world is, the question is, can you balance what you're doing within the streams, restoration, or the alternatives of restoration or paving with the treatment in the uplands? And so much restoration is geared towards in-stream without treating the uplands where the source of the water and the contamination is taking place. That's where we see there needs to be a greater balance. I will mention that in North Carolina, at least, where mitigation banking takes place and is largely bankers with backhoes and channels, they're starting to state that, gee, we've hit all the low-hanging fruit. We restored a lot of the low-water streams. What else can we do as part of mitigation banking? The state is now considering, well, perhaps we could start putting mitigation banks in green infrastructure or in upland restoration. And that's actually going along with some of the desires of the restoration industry as well. So I'll be interested to see Derek's talk next week because he'll be working further downstream.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think maybe one final question here. So we've got a question for models that consider pipe leakage. Where do you get those leakage estimates? Does the city provide that? Can you get how fine a grain can you get on that, on a per pipe basis, or do you estimate for a whole watershed?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That's a really good question, and we've been struggling with this for a few different reasons. One, that figure I showed you from Claire Welty's and Aditi Bhaskar's paper showed that they had an N of 2 for watersheds that they were drawing this from. You get that information when the city decides there's a problem. You hire a consultant to start doing I&I studies. You're actually putting in gauges and measuring the amount of water coming through the sanitary system. That's cumulative for up pipe for that entire network. And so these are few and far between. There is, of course, a certain amount of video cameras as you insert cameras up just so you can find those areas, but the amount of flow is gauged only at a few sites. As an example, Baltimore treats Baltimore County sanitary sewage. So they gauge the sewers at the city-county boundary so they could charge the county for the amount of water that they're actually treating. The county wants to minimize it because they don't want to pay that much to the city to treat groundwater, essentially. The city wants to minimize it because they don't want their treatment systems going over capacity. So really on a per pipe segment basis, we're nowhere near that at this point. It would be great if we could figure out sensor systems or geophysical systems to get those estimates, but right now they're bulk leakage. They're bulk leakage terms.
Okay. Got it. Well, I think that's probably what we have time for. Larry, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, and thanks to everyone for listening in and joining us. We hope you'll come back next 4 weeks for the rest of this series.
Great. Thanks very much, Seth, and thanks everybody for listening. I'm certainly interested in continuing the conversation. I should say we are working with 5 cities right now: Baltimore, Raleigh-Durham, Portland, Oregon, Phoenix, and Chicago, as part of a separate project, and we are speaking with people in other cities. I've spoken to a few of you, and we are interested in increasing the sample size so we can look across the different range of conditions that these cities are looking at. So thanks very much, everyone, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween to you. All right, take care, everybody.
Start screaming.
Thanks, Seth and Larry.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Emily.